A homeless boy found a suitcase with lots of money. When he revealed what he wanted in return, the millionaire broke down in tears. The cold wind sliced through the streets of Chicago as Alex pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his small frame. At just 11 years old, the streets had been his home for as long as he could remember. Life had never been kind to him. His earliest memories were of foster homes and temporary shelters, places where he was just another face in the crowd. By the time he turned 8, he had learned to fend for himself, surviving on discarded food, the occasional kind stranger, and his own sharp instincts. That morning, Alex woke up under the shelter of an abandoned storefront awning. He had chosen this spot carefully, away from the prying eyes of others who might try to steal what little he had. His backpack, his only possession, held a few crumbs of bread he had scavenged the night before and a ragged blanket that barely kept the frost at bay. The streets were quieter than usual as he wandered downtown, the kind of quiet that hinted at something important. Alex had developed a knack for reading the world around him. Today, it told him to keep moving, to look for something, anything that might improve his luck. Near the intersection of two busy streets, something caught his eye. Lying next to a bench, as if someone had left it behind in a rush, was a black suitcase. It was sleek and modern, the kind of thing Alex had only ever seen in movies or through shop windows. His heart pounded as he glanced around, half expecting someone to rush back for it. But the street was empty. He approached cautiously, his breath visible in the chilly air. The suitcase was heavier than he expected when he picked it up. A small tag on the handle read, Matthew Caldwell. He didn't recognize the name, but whoever it belonged to was clearly important or rich. Curiosity gnawed at him. With shaking hands, he unclasped the suitcase and opened it just a crack. Inside, he glimpsed stacks of cash neatly bound, papers with official seals, and what looked like a framed photo. His breath hitched. A suitcase like this could change his life. He could eat for weeks, maybe months. But as his fingers brushed the photo, his chest tightened. It was of a man standing proudly in front of a towering building, a smile on his face. The same name from the tag was engraved on the building's plaque. Alex hesitated. Taking the suitcase meant survival, but keeping it felt wrong. Alex's hands trembled as he stared at the contents of the suitcase. The neatly bound stacks of $100 bills seemed almost unreal, like something out of a dream or a movie. He gently ran his fingers over the cash, his mind racing. He didn't even need to count it to know it was more money than he could ever imagine. For a moment, the temptation was overwhelming. He thought about all the things he could do with it. A warm bed in a cheap motel, 3 meals a day, clean clothes, maybe even a way out of the streets. It was the kind of lifeline he'd prayed for during countless cold nights. His stomach growled, and his fingers tightened around the handle of the suitcase. But then his gaze fell back on the photo. The man in the picture had a kind smile and a look of confidence, like someone who had worked hard for everything he owned. The building behind him, marked Caldwell Enterprises, suggested he was someone important, someone powerful. Alex's gut told him this wasn't just anyone's suitcase. The boy hesitated, glancing up and down the street. No one was around. The sensible thing would be to walk away, keep the suitcase, and figure out how to use the money to survive. But a quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered something else. What if this money isn't mine to take? Alex bit his lip, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He'd seen others on the streets do desperate things, stealing, fighting, even lying to get by. But he had always prided himself on being different. No matter how hard things got, he refused to lose his sense of right and wrong. Still, it wasn't an easy choice. He crouched near the bench and closed the suitcase, his heart pounding as he hugged it close to his chest. Should he try to find this Matthew Caldwell? What if Caldwell was cruel or didn't believe him? What if Alex was blamed for stealing? As the wind whipped around him, Alex stood up, the suitcase feeling heavier than before. He didn't know what he was going to do, but one thing was clear: he couldn't just take the money and walk away. This could be my chance, Alex whispered to himself, his breath visible in the cold air. Maybe he can help me. Tightening his grip on the suitcase, he started walking toward the nicer part of town, where skyscrapers and expensive cars filled the streets. It was a long shot, but he had to try. The suitcase felt heavier with every step Alex took toward the towering glass building marked Caldwell Enterprises. He clutched it tightly, his fingers numb from the cold, but he didn't dare loosen his grip. The sight of the massive skyscrapers in this part of town made him feel small and out of place, but he kept walking. He reached the front entrance of the building and paused, staring up at its sleek, mirrored surface. His reflection stared back at him, scruffy, dirty, and wearing clothes that had seen far better days. He felt a pang of doubt. Why would anyone here take me seriously? He thought. But then he looked down at the suitcase, reminding himself why he was there. Taking a deep breath, Alex pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped inside. The lobby was grander than anything he'd ever seen, with polished marble floors and a massive chandelier hanging overhead. Men and women in suits strode by with purpose, barely sparing him a glance. He felt a lump form in his throat, but he forced himself to approach the reception desk. A woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a perfectly tailored blazer, looked up from her computer as Alex approached. Her polite smile faltered the moment she saw him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone wary. Hi," Alex said, his voice shaking. "I need to see Mr. Matthew Caldwell. It's really important." The woman raised an eyebrow, glancing at the suitcase in his hands. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I found this," Alex said quickly, lifting the suitcase slightly. "It belongs to him. I think it's really important, and I need to give it back to him." The receptionist stared at him, then at the suitcase, her expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. "Wait here," she said, picking up the phone and dialing a number. Alex shifted nervously, feeling the eyes of a nearby security guard on him. Minutes passed like hours as he stood there, clutching the suitcase. Eventually, the receptionist hung up and turned back to him. "A member of Mr. Caldwell's security team will meet you shortly," she said curtly. Alex swallowed hard as a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit appeared moments later. The guard's sharp eyes scanned Alex from head to toe. "You're the one with the suitcase?" he asked in a gruff voice. "Yes," Alex replied. "I found it. I just want to return it." "Come with me," the guard said, motioning for Alex to follow. As they walked deeper into the building, Alex's heart pounded. The pristine hallways, the polished offices, the expensive artwork on the walls. It all felt like a different world. He wondered what kind of man Matthew Caldwell was, and if he would even believe Alex's story. Finally, they reached an elegant meeting room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The guard gestured for Alex to wait, then disappeared. Alex clutched the suitcase tighter, his nerves building. The door opened, and a man entered. Alex instantly recognized him from the photo in the suitcase. Matthew Caldwell was tall and commanding, with neatly combed silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to size Alex up in an instant. "What's this about?" Matthew asked, his voice calm but firm. Alex took a shaky breath and stepped forward, holding out the suitcase. "I found this near a bench downtown. I thought it might be yours." Matthew's eyes flicked to the suitcase, then back to Alex. His expression was unreadable as he reached out and took it. For a moment, the room was silent as Matthew opened the suitcase and inspected its contents. When he looked up, his gaze softened slightly, though his tone remained measured. "Why didn't you keep it?" he asked. Alex hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because it's not mine, and I thought you might need it more than I do." Matthew Caldwell studied Alex carefully, his piercing blue eyes scanning the boy's face as if trying to uncover hidden motives. The room was silent, except for the faint sound of the wind brushing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You found this near a bench downtown?" Matthew asked, his voice calm but laced with skepticism. Alex nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. It was just sitting there. I figured it must have belonged to someone important, so I brought it back." Matthew's expression didn't change. He opened the suitcase again, his hands briefly skimming over the neat stacks of cash and papers inside. Then he closed it with a click and placed it on the table beside him. "You could have walked away with it," Matthew said, his tone neutral. "You'd probably be halfway across the city by now, and I'd have no idea who you were. Why didn't you?" Alex hesitated, shifting his weight nervously. "Because it wasn't mine," he said softly. "I've been through enough to know what it's like to lose something important. I didn't want to be the kind of person who takes from someone else, even if I needed it." Matthew tilted his head slightly, his stern gaze softening just a fraction. "You said you found it near a bench. Do you have any idea how it got there?" Alex shook his head. "No, sir. I just saw it and thought." "It was my fault," Matthew interrupted, leaning back in his chair with a sigh. I had a meeting at one of the cafes near that area. I put the suitcase down while I was on a call, and I forgot it. Walked right into my car and left without it. A stupid mistake. Alex blinked in surprise. You forgot it? Matthew let out a short, humorless chuckle. Yes, even people like me make mistakes. I realized it was missing an hour later and assumed it was gone for good. I never expected someone like you to bring it back. The room went quiet again. Matthew's words lingered, heavy with implication. He had said someone like you, and Alex knew exactly what he meant. I didn't do it for a reward, Alex said suddenly, breaking the silence. I just thought you should have it back. Matthew looked at the boy, his expression unreadable. Finally, he asked, so what do you want in return? Alex froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Alex's hands gripped the edge of his chair tightly. Matthew's question echoed in his mind. What do you want in return? It was a simple question, but Alex hadn't prepared for it. He hadn't walked into this building expecting to ask for anything. He thought returning the suitcase was just the right thing to do. No strings attached. And yet, sitting across from this man, who had everything Alex could only dream of, he felt an opportunity slipping through his fingers. He looked down at his hands, dirty and cracked from the cold Chicago streets, before forcing himself to meet Matthew's eyes. I don't want money, if that's what you're thinking. Matthew raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. No? Then what do you want? Alex hesitated. The words felt heavy in his throat, but he finally let them out. I just want a chance, he said quietly. A chance to be someone better. To get off the streets. To prove that I'm more than just some homeless kid people avoid on the sidewalk. Matthew didn't respond immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered Alex's words. The boy could feel his heart pounding in the silence. He half expected Matthew to laugh, to dismiss him, to call security, and have him thrown out. Why me? Matthew finally asked, his tone curious but calm. Why not go to a shelter? Or the police? Why would you think I'd help you? Alex swallowed hard, fighting the lump in his throat. Because I've tried those places before. The shelters, they're full. The police, he trailed off, his face tightening. They don't care about kids like me. You look like someone who might actually listen. Matthew's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe curiosity. Maybe something deeper. You don't want money, Matthew repeated, almost to himself. You want a chance. Alex nodded, his gaze steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. Yes, sir. That's all I'm asking for. For a moment, Matthew said nothing. The silence in the room stretched, and Alex felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, Matthew sighed and stood up, walking toward the window. You've surprised me, Alex, he said, his back to the boy. But surprises aren't always good. He turned slightly, looking over his shoulder. Stay here. I need to think. As Matthew walked out of the room, Alex slumped back in his chair, unsure whether he had just ruined his one and only shot or if he had planted a seed of hope. The door clicked shut as Matthew left the room, leaving Alex alone with his thoughts. He sat there, staring at the suitcase still resting on the table, his heart pounding. Had he said too much? Had he ruined his chance? Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Alex could hear muffled voices outside the room and the distant sound of footsteps echoing through the polished hallways. His stomach churned with anxiety. He thought about leaving, just slipping out before Matthew could come back with an answer he didn't want to hear. But where would he even go? Back to the streets? Finally, the door creaked open again, and Matthew walked back in. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of thoughtfulness. He sat down across from Alex, steepled his fingers, and took a deep breath. I've made up my mind, Matthew said, his tone steady. I'm going to give you a chance, Alex. One night here, under my roof. Food, a warm bed, and safety. Tomorrow, we'll decide what comes next. Alex blinked, stunned. Really? Yes, Matthew replied, standing up. But let me be clear, this isn't charity. I want to see who you are beyond the words you've said today. You've already surprised me, but I need to know I'm not making a mistake. Alex nodded quickly, his chest tightening with relief. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I won't let you down. The hours that followed were surreal. Alex was shown to a small guest room, far more comfortable than any place he'd slept before. He was given clean clothes and a hot meal, simple acts of kindness that felt overwhelming after years of hardship. For the first time in years, he let himself relax. But the next morning, Alex's cautious optimism was shattered. It started in the dining room, where Matthew sat at the head of a long table, sipping his coffee. Alex joined him hesitantly, his eyes darting around the pristine space. He was about to thank Matthew again when a tall man in a suit entered the room, his expression grim. He leaned down to whisper something in Matthew's ear, and Alex watched as the millionaire's expression darkened. Matthew set down his coffee slowly, his piercing gaze shifting toward Alex. "What's wrong?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Matthew's voice was steady but cold. "One of my watches is missing. A very expensive one. It was last seen in the study last night." Alex frowned, confusion flashing across his face. "I don't know anything about that." The man in the suit cleared his throat. "The boy was the only one near the study after dinner," he said sharply. Alex felt his stomach drop. "No, I didn't take anything," he protested, his voice cracking. "I went to the study, but I was just looking for the bathroom. I swear." Matthew stared at Alex, his expression unreadable. The room felt suffocating as the accusation hung in the air. "I told you this would happen," the man muttered to Matthew. "You can't trust someone like him." "I didn't do it," Alex said again, his voice trembling. "I swear I didn't." Matthew let out a slow breath and stood. "Stay here," he said firmly, his gaze lingering on Alex. "I'll handle this." But Alex didn't stay. The humiliation and betrayal were too much. As soon as Matthew left the room, Alex grabbed his backpack from the guest room and bolted for the front door. He didn't even look back as he ran out into the cold Chicago streets, his chest tight and his mind racing. He had risked everything to do the right thing, and now it felt like none of it mattered. The biting wind stung Alex's face as he ran down the empty streets of Chicago, his breath visible in the frosty air. He didn't know where he was going, he just needed to get away. Away from the mansion, away from the accusations, away from the pain of knowing he wasn't trusted. His chest burned as he slowed to a walk, ducking into an alleyway and sinking to the ground. The events of the morning replayed in his mind on an endless loop. The disbelief in Matthew's eyes, the cold certainty in the man's voice when he said the words, "You were near the study." Alex clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had done everything right, everything. And it still wasn't enough. But then through the whirlwind of frustration and sadness, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered, "You didn't do anything wrong." Alex looked down at his worn shoes and took a shaky breath. He hadn't stolen that watch. He knew it, and Matthew would know it too, if Alex could prove it. Standing up, he adjusted his backpack and set his jaw with new determination. Back at the mansion, Matthew paced his office, the missing watch weighing heavily on his mind. He had replayed the accusation in his head several times, yet something didn't sit right. Alex had looked genuinely hurt, even broken, by the suggestion that he had taken it. "Sir," said the man in the suit, Gerald, his head of security. "I've checked the cameras, but there's nothing conclusive. The boy was in the study briefly, but he left empty-handed." Matthew froze. "Empty-handed?" "Yes, sir." And Gerald hesitated. "There's something else. The housekeeping staff saw one of the other workers near the study late last night. James, one of the newer hires." Matthew's eyes narrowed. "James? The one who vouched for Alex being near the study?" "Yes, sir." Matthew felt a surge of anger. If James had fabricated the accusation to frame Alex, then Matthew had made a terrible mistake. He couldn't shake the image of the boy's face as he protested his innocence. "I want James questioned," Matthew said firmly, "and find out if the watch turns up." Meanwhile, Alex had returned to the streets, retracing his steps from the mansion. He figured if he could clear his name, he'd have to start where everything began. His gut told him that someone else in the house might have taken the watch, and it had to be someone who saw him as an easy target. A nearby pawn shop, Alex hid his first lead. The owner, a wiry man in his 60s, narrowed his eyes at the mention of a golden watch. "Yeah, someone was in here earlier this morning trying to sell a piece like that. Didn't buy it though, too hot. Said he'd come back later." "Do you remember what he looked like?" Alex asked, his heart pounding. The owner shrugged. "Tall guy, blonde hair. Looked like he didn't belong on your side of town." Alex felt a flicker of hope. It had to be James. He was sure of it. Now, he just needed to find a way to get back to Matthew and tell him the truth. Back at the mansion, Gerald's investigation uncovered even more damning evidence against James. When Matthew learned the truth, guilt washed over him. He allowed his staff's prejudices to influence his judgment, and because of it, Alex was gone. "Find him," Matthew said to Gerald, his voice tight with emotion. "Find Alex and bring him back." But Alex was already making his way back to the mansion, clutching the tiny shred of evidence he had gathered. For the first time since he'd run, he felt like the weight of the accusation might finally lift. Alex stood at the gates of the mansion, hesitating. His hands trembled slightly, clutching his backpack as he stared up at the imposing structure. Returning here felt like stepping into a lion's den, but he had no choice. He had a lead, a slim one, but it was enough to fight for his name. He approached the intercom, pressed the button, and waited. A crackling voice came through. "Who is it?" "It's Alex," he said, his voice firm despite the knot of nerves in his stomach. "I need to speak to Mr. Caldwell. I have proof I didn't take the watch." There was silence for a moment, then a buzz as the gate opened. Alex walked up the long driveway, his legs feeling heavier with each step. When he reached the front door, it opened before he could knock. Gerald stood there, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Caldwell is waiting for you in the study," Gerald said. Alex followed him inside, the mansion's warmth a sharp contrast to the icy streets he had just left behind. As they walked, Alex braced himself for whatever reaction Matthew might have. Would he even listen? When Alex entered the study, Matthew was standing by the window, his back to the door. The golden sunlight cast long shadows across the room. "You came back," Matthew said without turning around. "I had to," Alex said, setting his backpack on the floor. "I need you to know the truth." Matthew turned, his eyes scanning Alex's face. "Go on." Alex took a deep breath. "I went to a pawn shop downtown," he began. "The owner said someone tried to sell a golden watch there earlier today. He didn't take it, but I got a description." He paused, his voice steady. "It was James." Matthew's expression darkened. "James." "Yes," Alex said firmly. "The security guy, Gerald, said the cameras showed I didn't take anything. But James told you I did, right? He's lying. He set me up." At that moment, Gerald entered the room, holding a familiar object in his hand, a gold watch. "We found it," Gerald said, handing it to Matthew. "It was hidden in James's locker." He confessed. Matthew stared at the watch, his jaw tightening. "I was wrong," he said quietly, his gaze lifting to meet Alex's. Alex stepped back slightly, unsure of what to say. "Alex," Matthew said, his voice soft but heavy with regret. "I owe you an apology. I'll let my own doubts and the biases of others cloud my judgment. You didn't deserve that." Alex's chest felt tight, but he nodded. I just wanted a chance," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Matthew took a deep breath, setting the watch down on the desk. "And you'll still have one," he said, "if you'll let me make this right." Alex blinked in surprise. "You still want to help me?" Matthew stepped closer, his expression sincere. "Yes. You've proven your character in a way that very few people could. You didn't run from the truth, you ran toward it. And I see now that you're someone worth believing in." Weeks later, Alex's life had changed in ways he never thought possible. Matthew had not only welcomed him back into the mansion, but had also started laying out a plan to help him get back on his feet. Alex was enrolled in school, with tutors helping him catch up on the years he had missed. He had his own room, warm meals, and most importantly, trust. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Alex turned to Matthew. "Why didn't you give up on me?" he asked. Matthew smiled faintly, staring into the flames. "Because you reminded me of something I had forgotten," he said. "That even in the darkest circumstances, there's hope. And sometimes, all someone needs is for someone else to believe in them." Alex felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged. And this was only the beginning.